The effects of digital on the dissemination, quality and reception of music. This is a lecture I recorded at the Atrium in the University of Glamorgan, Cardiff. The reason I've put this lecture up on YouTube is because the subject matter is just so interesting, and it causes you to look at the music industry in a completely different way. For most of the people who subscribe and visit this channel, I think they'd find this really interesting. I'd also love to have your feedback, so leave any thoughts you have on the subject down below in the comments. Sorry about the quality. This was recorded on a handheld recorder just stuck down by my feet.
So we're going to be looking at the impacts of digital on dissemination, quality and reception of music. We're going to be looking at it in terms of technological, sociological and cultural impacts. And I'm probably going to talk a bit fast because I've had 2 cups of coffee. But anytime you want to jump in, just jump in. Just interrupt anytime you want. There will be something about impacts of copyright protection, but I'm not going to talk about that in particular. And I'm not going to really talk about impacts of government reports and policies, though there's implicit content of that kind of stuff. So we're looking at music in the digital age, and this is the idea that I'm going to be talking about the digital age. If I'm talking about the digital age, what does it imply? What came before? Analog age. Okay, so that's the technology and that's the terminology I'm going to be using, the analog age. Now, you're all analog. You're all brought up, I guess, in the analog era, me too. So we're going to be looking at that kind of era, that kind of idea. What became before digital, what music came before digital, which is analog, and how do you talk about the change from one era, which is essentially analog, to another era, because there has to be some kind of mechanism for looking at it. So I'm going to take you through some of this, of how we got to the digital age. And the way I'm going to do that is by talking about different ages of media. And this is from a guy called Andrew Dubber, talking about 5 ages of media. What happens in these ages of media is that we have a complete media environment. And what this does is it constructs the way that we look at the world and the way we interact with the world. And it constructs our brain and the way we can think. Each new media environment is a development not only social, but a development in our humanity in some ways, or in the structure of our brain at least. So our wiring is different in response to different technological concepts. I mean, look what we're doing here. iPadding it up here, recording it, again, tablets. We're approaching the world in a different way these days than we ever did. So it not only affects music, it affects all society, all right? And we've got to think about it in those kind of terms. First stage, of course, if I haven't pressed them, is the oral age. And this is, still apparent in many music cultures throughout the world, isn't it? It's an oral culture. It's music as storytelling. So the medium is speech, and the music is an extension of speech. It's a kind of narrative. And this is what we might call folk music in many cultures, isn't it? If you look at kind of Aboriginal culture, or what's the more accepted word for Eskimos? Inuit culture, that's right. What you've got is narrative stories and myths, really. In the oral age, the main way in which music is produced and consumed is communally through rituals. And we still do this, don't we? We'll be doing this next week when they're playing rugby. We get together and all shout for the same kind of thing. Or, when we're getting married, or whatever kind of celebration or ritual or mourning or ceremony is, it's not professional, it's something everybody does. Everybody's a musician, all right? And in quite a lot of the countries in the world, everybody's still a musician. It was only 100 years ago, with the rise of industrialization, that stopped people becoming musicians in the West, wasn't it? 150 years ago, before phonography, everybody was a musician in Britain, really, weren't they? What we've had is this age of industrialization where it said, you're not a musician, you're a musician. But we're coming out of that now because we all have iPads, aren't we? Anybody could be a musician. I showed my daughter how to record this song she's been working on from this musical, Pitch Perfect, the other day. Have you seen this movie, Pitch Perfect? It's a girl who has a cup and she turns it upside down and sings this song. My daughter saw this, she thought it was fantastic. So she's been learning it and stuff like that, and I showed her on an iPad how to record it the other day. put 2 or 3 tracks on it, you just couldn't get it off, in the end. So she turned into a musician in 5 minutes. The oral age, not that she wasn't, she was to start with. So the oral age comes from the dawn and lasts about 10,000 years, and this is the first immediate age. Lots of places in the world still in the oral age. It's still around in our culture in many ways. Like I say, I'm going to run on with this a bit. Second media age, the scribal age. This is, of course, when specialisms come in. And we start writing. The medium is writing. It's passed down from generation. Rather than being passed down from generation to generation, as in the oral age, as in Aboriginal cultures, what we've got now is we've got skills coming in, where we've got the power of the church, because there's only a few people have these skills. Not everybody can read and write, and they're producing these really elaborate texts. And this is when music really moves into echelons of power. And for a long time, the church controlled it, didn't they? What do they say? The devil has all the best tunes. Because the church only used certain keys, didn't they? They only used certain notes. So in the scribal age, the medium's writing here, and it gets preserved. We've got the skill of literacy. We only have a few texts because we have a few scribes. The main way in which music is produced and consumed is it's being passed down from a hierarchy to a kind of scribal elite. The oral age still exists. The scribal age doesn't wipe it out. It still exists. But music becomes specialised, and things like the composer emerges. And musicians become entertainers. And they get supported through patronage. Now, vestiges of that culture still exist, don't they? What's the legitimated music of Britain? When I say legitimated, I mean legitimated by the government, i.e. the government that represents us, so our society. Which music does our society suggest is the biggest music in Britain? Which do they pay the most money for? Which do they support? Well, they don't support popular music. They support classical music. Okay, 90% of the money that the government gives to music goes to classical music, all right, through the Arts Council. So it's supported through patronage. Other kinds of entertainers, of course, have to go out on the street and do it themselves. This is the second media age, then the scribal age, lasted about 1,500 years, depending on where you live, of course. So, and these are big changes. Scribal age was a big change, but the next change was probably the biggest change of all. And that, of course, was the invention of the printing press. And what the printing press did, it brought in the print age in a big way. And what this did, it changed the shape of the world. Because it allowed everybody to read and write. It allowed everybody to read these books, it allowed everybody to access knowledge, and it allowed everybody to have an opinion for the first time. Because they didn't have somebody telling them what to do, they could read it themselves. So the medium here is mass-produced books, and this was bigger than the internet, or as big as the internet. We can't say anything about the internet, it's only been going for 20 years, hasn't it, really? But this was a massive change, the invention of the printing press. Knowledge could be made and distributed, resulted in the spread of the Bible. So we had all these revolutions throughout the world as people got hold of this knowledge and said, hang on a minute, what's going on here? Political reform all over the place. The message is now in everybody's hands. So our brains change because we have the message, we have the power. We can think about these kind of things and we can make decisions. We develop a new sense of the individual. We develop things like sequential logic, cross-referencing, and this lasts about 500 years. So we're talking about, 15th century, late 15th century to 19th, 20th century. Yeah. And this brings in, eventually, the start of the industrial age. In the print age, the main way in which music is produced and consumed is through publishing and copyright. So we get sheet music. And sheet music becomes the industry, doesn't it, for the next 500 years, really. Sheet music is something you can control. You can write down the preferred version. And that's what they did in classical music, of course, and you weren't meant to deviate from that preferred version. People buy mass-produced sheet music to play at home. Music can be created, distributed and retailed. So that's the kind of backstory really until we come into the industrial age. And the industrial age starts off with the invention of phonography in musical terms, and comes into the 20th century where it turns into the electric age. The invention of electronic microphones, radio and stuff like that. And this is the analog age. This is what we understand about music, where the main medium is records and things to play records on and things to look at, which is radio and TV. So it can be mass produced now, and it can be captured as audio or images and joined together with images, mass broadcast. It can be experienced with other people simultaneously. You can collect records, you can play them at home. You can do that before. It was a mass medium, wasn't it? It was a collective medium rather, a community medium. So again, the way in which our brains take information about the world and the way we live is fundamentally altered. The main way in which music is produced and consumed is industrial. So, to stop me talking and to get you talking, give us some examples of this kind. We talked about recording here. Sheet music industry fights the record business which comes in. Mass culture is expressed through these kind of things. The electric age only lasted about 100 years. It's finished now. A lot of people don't think it's finished. Music industry doesn't want it to finish. They're making so much money. But let's just talk about that now. What kind of things am I talking about here? That's analog behaviour, analog practices. What's the characteristics of analog music? And of course, that's just a preamble to talk about digital music. But go on, give us some examples. Let's just have a bit of a discussion for 5 or 10 minutes.
The method is recorded on?
Yeah, go on, say a bit more. Yeah.
They used to use tape recorder rather than the digital format?
Yeah, and not only that, but they were expensive, weren't they? And not everybody had a recording studio like they have a digital recording studio, so you had to go to some place, didn't you? So it was expensive, and there were guys in white coats, weren't they, going, no, you can't go into the red, mate. Has to be done this way. Go on, so recording process completely different. Other ideas. Can't just chuck anything out. I can recycle most things.
Hardest to distribute.
Sorry?
It's hardest to distribute.
Distribution's completely different. It's all controlled by 4 or 5 companies, and they have their own distribution networks, and they control what goes in those networks. Yeah. So control of recording, control of distribution. What about practices and behaviours as well? I mean, most of you guys are musicians, aren't you?
It's a lot more time consuming.
It is a lot more time consuming. I mean, would you bother to learn an instrument these days if you were just starting out? I mean, the idea of what a musician is. I mean, that's a 20th century question, isn't it? People ask me that. When I say, well, they say, what do you do? I say, well, I teach courses on popular music. They say, oh, what do you play? I say, I don't play anything. They say, well, surely you're a musician. I said, well, yeah, I'm a musician, but it doesn't mean I have to. What's the question mean? Are you a musician? Are you musical, they say. What does it mean? It means, do you play some 19th century instrument? Doesn't it? Are you a musician if you can knock something off like my daughter yesterday, knocked a quick tune up on iTunes, on GarageBand? Because that's what musicians are nowadays, aren't they? If you looked at those analog music, I mean, what they were doing, they were all guitar solos, that kind of stuff. That's analog, isn't it? It's guys learning to play to be good with tools. It's industrial. It's learning those kind of things. What was your biggest involvement? What was your biggest financial outlay of your youth? Records. Collecting. That's industrial, isn't it? They don't do that these days. Nobody bothers with collecting. So all that kind of behaviour is all industrial. You know, there's loads of it. Any other examples? Come on, chuck stuff out. Because you need to know that you need to think about it in these kind of terms in order to flip it over and think about it in digital terms. I mean, I've got some examples a bit later. Okay, well, let's just have a few. So analog music, as you pointed out, is a product. It's a thing. This is all about music as product. And the whole system was set up to get you to collect this stuff, wasn't it? Shops, all that kind of stuff, distribution networks. Only a few can get into the recording studios. We're going to write about it in newspapers. It's all about the history of the music industry, isn't it? You've got to collect this stuff, haven't you? Who's the greatest guitarist of all time? He's got to have his record. You know, what's the 10 best albums? All that kind of stuff, got to have that. So it's about scarcity, restricting access while maximising exposure. You know, you can hear it on the radio, but it's coming out in a couple of weeks' time, and then you have to go down the shop and get it, or else put an order in, and you know, it's industrial practices, isn't it? Industrial categorisation. You know, what music do you like? Oh, I like metal, or you know, I like soul music. So you're categorising yourself as a person, building some kind of industrial identity as to who you are, because it's industrial, the product, and it demands that. So you get these kind of great attachments to certain kinds of music. You a fan of certain bands? Mumford & Sons. Were you a fan when you were younger of certain bands?
Yeah, Adamant.
Adamant.
I remember loving that.
I went to see them, right?
What about you?
Yeah, I was a punk guy.
Punk.
Punk was on me, yeah.
Well, that's good. See, punk, I mean, you get a whole lifestyle there in a box, don't you? You know, you get the records, you get the clothes, you get the friends, you know, the political views, the whole kind of caboodle there. It's all wrapped up in, and it used to be like that, didn't it?
Yeah, we get sort of more modern pop stuff, really.
All right. Were you big on anybody?
Yeah, Nightwish.
What?
Nightwish, Metallica, all the heavy.
All right. So you get the whole caboodle, if you're a metal fan as well, don't you? The viewpoints, the ideologies, what you can do and what you can't do. So we talked about recording equipment, facilities, access to sound, high fidelity. That's another thing, wasn't it? You used to have a hi-fi, you know, which talked about how you listen to it. That doesn't happen anymore, does it? People aren't interested in what its quality is. So all these are industrial practices. All the music was aimed at fitting into a kind of chronological whole about what music was. Unbeknown to us, it was just analog music. Analog business, of course, was about control. It was about records. Records were just a bubble, though. They only happened for a certain period and then they disappeared. Control of systems, it was about some people being consumers and some people being content providers. It was about physical distribution, sold in units, vinyl, tapes, CDs, back catalogue. One-way culture. One-way culture means it's coming from the music industry and going out to the passive consumers. It's about music as entertainment, isn't it? You're buying an entertainment product. It is not only a physical product, but it's a financial product. It's about music as a noun, i.e. something you buy. And the record overtook live performance, didn't it? When I was young, people released singles, and when you saw them do it on record, on live, they'd just start off and then they'd improvise for 5 minutes or something like that before coming back and playing the rest of the record. You wouldn't do that. No. If you don't play the same version that they've got on the record, people get disappointed. So the record becomes the most important thing. Producers put down the record in the recording studio, and the bands have to learn how to play it like that. So difficult a transition there. Here's a quote from Brian Eno. He's equating records to whale blubber. Said if you had a lot of whale blubber in the 1840s, you were a really rich man. But when electricity got invented, you know, just time moved on. And that's the same with the record industry, really. Time's moved on and left everybody with the record stuff, you know. holding. It's been replaced. It was all about control of broadcasting, so 2 channels, 3 channels, 4 channels, that kind of stuff. Control of magazines, so the Enemy, the Melody Maker, Smash Hits, told you what to buy. These, of course, were owned by the major music corporations, so they kind of, it was more of a kind of advertising, which still is really, funneling you into certain areas. The job of the media is to create demand. The job of the music media is to create demand. Yeah. And these were full of gatekeepers, of course. And we knew some of those gatekeepers, didn't we? We read those magazines, and you knew some of those writers, whoever they were. Ian Penman, Julie Burchill, Charles Shaw Murray, some of these other guys. And we looked at their opinions, and we had an idea of who they were, and formed a kind of cultural group around them. And these are some of the practices and behaviour I've talked about here, where you get a certain hierarchy of involvement that's classically organised really in the 19th century way, where at the top of the tree are the composers, classical composers, and at the bottom of the tree are passive listeners. Composer, performer, critic, musicians, listener, producer, consumer, etc. Active musicians, passive listeners. And all this is what we grew up with, analogue behaviour, that certain people are more musical than others. And of course, digital sweeping all this kind of ideas away. They were only put in there in the first place to gatekeep, so that certain people could say, well, I know more than you about it, because it's analogue music practices. Learning to play old instruments. Yeah. Anybody teach? Yeah. So we can get onto some of your experience when we talk about digital, because has teaching changed on the digital? Yeah. So, but in analogue behaviour, this is how we approached it. We approached it through learning to play instruments. If you wanted to be musical, you learn to play an instrument. And we talked about technique or virtuosity. Is that an analogue idea? I don't think in metal, because metal has a bit of analogue, but has a lot of virtuosity. As a guitarist, I think, possibly. So, some kind of hierarchy of involvement there. Constructing identity. We talked about punk or metal. Whereas we talked about tribal behaviour. Collecting. Guy who sits next to me is a music collector. He collects certain kinds of music. It's big in mod and all its variants and things like that. And he knows catalogue numbers and stuff like that. Goes to record fairs. Sometimes they trade this music. They don't take it out of the box, do they? Because it's worth more if it hasn't been unwrapped, stuff like that. Collecting music. Downloading. How many people get the music for free off the internet? You guys are really analog, aren't you? So all this kind of compulsive. How many people still buy CDs? But we've got 5 people who are lying. I download all my music off the internet.
No, for free.
Yeah,
For free. Yeah.
For free, I pay for mine.
Oh, you pay for yours? All right. Well, that's okay. No one's making any value jokes. I've played for a record for years. So, this whole idea of constructing fans in this kind of compulsive way is analogue in many ways. Intensity of experience. Do people have the same intensity of experience? I mean, people used to be real big fans of bands, didn't they? And now, I don't know whether that's true. I mean, it's probably true when you're 13 and 14 and 15. But is it the same kind of idea? So, identity work here. Youth tribes, they've disappeared, haven't they? Really, largely, I would say. Subcultures. And this idea of music as astronauts, this is what used to happen when I was growing up. You'd see musicians who were, into looking for the future. like James T. Kirk and that kind of thing. And they were journeying out there, they were discovering new kinds of music, and in a few years everybody would catch up and they'd go on somewhere else. It was always a kind of chronology of music that was constructed in analogue. And this is what I was brought up in, and I think it's what most people were brought up in, and many people still have the idea that this is what the music industry, or music in general, is. But really it's not. It was only the analogue industry, which was the 20th century industry. The music industry would like it to keep going on, of course, because they made buckets of money in that time. But it's changed. And let's have a look. One of the ways I've used to look at change is a quote from Marshall McLuhan, who says we can never see where we are, all we can see is where we've been, which I thought was an interesting quote when it came up. He calls it the rear view mirror effect. You can't really see what's happening around you, all you can see is what's happening in the past. And then you can only see what's happening in the past when you're in a process of change. So it's only in the last 10 years, and really a bit less than that, the last 4 or 5 years, that everybody's going, whoa, we've just come out of that era. And we're just entering into this new one. So there's loads of written work just been appearing right now on the idea that we're just coming out of one era and we're moving into a new era. People still cling to what I call the rear view mirror view of the world. By this I mean to say, because of the invisibility of any environment, we're not aware of it, it's invisible. During the period of its innovation, man is only consciously aware of the environment that's preceded it. And that's what I've been trying to describe really as a way to getting onto digital. We can look at what happened in the past. An environment only becomes fully visible only when it has been superseded by a new environment. Thus we're always one step behind in our view of the world. And this is Marshall McLuhan talking in the late 1960s about that. Also, another way to look at it is through Raymond Williams. Raymond Williams, great cultural theorist, Welsh guy, of course. And he's asking the question, how can we tell that one epoch is ending and another one is beginning? Does one door open and another one closes? Well, of course, it's not like that. He talks about it in 3 kinds of practices. Anybody got any examples they want to shout out? We could probably fit him in this. He talks about dominant practices, that everybody's doing. He talks about residual practices that have been, still hanging on for usually social reasons, political reasons, and emergent practices of where we're going in the future. Of course, it's not simple. What they are is, at every stage there's a process of dynamic contradictory relationships. So all these are rubbing up against each other all the time. It's not simply we used to do that, we're going to do this, we've been doing this, and those things are in the future. Anybody come up with any example of musical behaviour? We'll try and fit it into this. I suppose you could talk about teaching in those terms, couldn't it? Well, could you talk about them? You teach, aren't you?
In terms of this?
What?
In terms of this?
Yeah, when I went to school, I went to secondary school music class. First day we went in there, 30 of us, and music teacher said, stand up, and I want you to sing this note. So 30 of us stood up and sung this note, and he went round and he went, sit down. Sit down. Went around the class, listened to everybody. In the end, there were 5 people standing. He said, right, you 5 stay here, rest of you are off to woodwork. That was my musical career, or not career, teaching. And these are based on residual ideas of 19th century notions of what it is to be musical, i.e. you had to hold a note in his world, and that made you musical. And it was the classical syllabus is largely on, imitating other practices, isn't it? Whereas, I don't know what's been dominant, what's emerging in teaching. YouTube. Learn it on YouTube now, don't you? What's been dominant, really, you'd still learn music through the classical syllabus, wouldn't you, really, in the 20th century? How many people learn music through those grade exams? Through the classical syllabus? Nobody. All right. Dominant practices that you would have, how would you have learned music then?
in the guitar you would have learned to read music, but now you don't. You learn tablature, so you don't need to read music.
All right. Okay, so what would have been dominant is learning to read music and play it off sheet music. All right. So we'll talk about that. It's just a kind of visual to get you to think about how do we talk about change and how do we assess change in these kind of ways. Emergent signposts of the future, ubiquitous codes of the present day, and then signs of the past. In music, there's a lot of residual stuff going on because of the way music's been taught. I mean, teaching music in this country is a disaster, isn't it? Complete disaster in schools. You know, you got something like, something like 90% of kids give it up the first time they can. You know, there's only something like 8% of kids go on to take it at O level. Because it's largely run by 19th century ideas of what music is. You know, I mean, there's some improvement, but that's the state of play in it. So just visuals there to get you to think of some of the changes that have gone on in the digital age. So in the digital age, and we started in the digital age, in the 1980s, CDs came out. Early 90s, MP3s started coming out. The medium, of course, is multimedia here. It's connected with everything else, isn't it? Cross-media, transmedia. And it's changed by, the stuff that we've all got in our pockets. I mean, we're carrying around recording studios with us, aren't we? We're carrying around music collections with us. We're carrying around instruments, just in everyday what we walk around with. This is Marshall McLuhan's rear view mirror idea of things. People aren't ready to see it as a digital world, so we call it by analog names. Just like they did in the beginning of the analog era. When they got new inventions at the beginning of analog era, they called them by pre-industrial names, like, the radio, they called it the wireless. And, the car, they call it the horseless carriage. This is what we do, don't we? We name it things like online radio. It's not online radio at all. It's a different thing. It radically impacts on everything we do, is once again changing our brains. The way we take in information, how we make sense of the world, is increasingly digital rather than broadcast or print. It's quite literally reshaping our brains of what we can do here. In the digital age, the main way in which music is produced and consumed is transmedia, isn't it? It's interactive. And it's convergent. It's not one thing anymore. It's half a dozen things at once. And that's where we got to, really. The digital age started in the 1980s, and that's where we are. Now, we're only just kind of easing our way into it. I think people started recognising this about 2008, 2009. I mean, everybody said, okay, it's digital, but they were all talking about the future. But I think about 4 or 5 years ago, people went, oh, it's the present now. And all that stuff about analogue is the past. So I suppose the challenge for you guys is to think about this in your business, in your application of it, isn't it? Let me give you a few more minutes. There's transmedia. That's the old format there, where you get a movie, a book in a single format. Now they come out on multiple platforms, cross-media, multimedia, transmedia. So, if you see that film, there's a ride attached to it, isn't there? There's a book attached to it. You get down McDonald's and have a meal attached to it. You're going to know when that thing's coming out, aren't you? I mean, give me some examples of this. I've obviously been talking too much here. I've talked into silence, haven't I? Well, James Bond, that's a good one, isn't it? You get James Bond food, I think you do. I've got a couple of kids. I know every time one of these things is coming out. So, and that's where music is. It doesn't exist on its own anymore. It exists in conjunction with a lot of other behaviours. And that's the key to exploiting it in many ways. Okay, let me give you 5 minutes to talk. Yeah. And ask you that same question. if I can. You can either think it up on your own or talk to the people next to you. Yeah. And we've done analog, so what are the qualities of digital music? What are the characteristics? What are the business concepts? Because this is what you're dealing with now, isn't it? I mean, what are particular digital behaviours? What are particular digital practices? We already talked about analog practices, you know, collecting stuff, you know, being big fans of stuff. What are particular digital behaviours? Because, of course, if you're going to make inroads into the music business, then that's the ideas that you need, isn't it? What's digital behaviour?
In work, what we've had to do now, we've had to digitalise everything, so we don't keep any hard copies of anything anymore.
All right.
Which is dangerous, because when the system goes down, you can't do anything.
All right, so it's fragile, isn't it? And also, what's the first thing that happens when you digitalise things? Well, it becomes public, isn't it? Potentially public. I mean, you might hide it away behind secure walls, but the first thing that happens when you digitalise something is it becomes public.
You can't even can't protect things even with local government authority and stuff. So I had a terrible virus come straight on my computer and it went straight through all the firewalls.
All right. So it's fragile and it becomes public. And of course, this is what all musicians have found out. You know, they can't protect their own work. So anything that's digital becomes able to be circulated. And it's fragile because, you know, it can crash and you can lose it. And people don't protect it because it's not a thing anymore. So, you know, you go to some website and they go, well, that's fantastic, look at all that stuff. And then next time you go there, 6 months later, half it's disappeared, hasn't it? Or it's been overwritten and things like that. So they're quite important qualities, aren't they? Quite important for storage and, you know, records of who we are. So, you know, all these big libraries and stuff, they're, you know, having to come up with massive policies, spending a lot of money how to, you know, protect this stuff. Not only protect it, but preserve it as well. So, yeah, that's a couple of good examples. You digitalise everything. And there are benefits to it, aren't there?
Yeah, like we know where everything's stored and we can all share files.
All right.
And just
So, what are the benefits from it?
It's a lot easier to work with other people, isn't it?
It's easy to work with other people, so it's essentially collaborative.
You know, we'll be sitting in the same room, we can just...
Right.
We don't do meetings anymore, so...
Time constraints are gone, like it's about 12 o'clock at night.
Okay. The main characteristic of digital is ease of access, and that's why we're doing it. And that's why, you know, we can access this music now. You know, we can access this data, things like that. Other stuff. Yeah, there's loads to talk about.
I suppose behaviour-wise, it's a lot more rapid, isn't it, the digital age, because it's more technology-driven, whereas in the past, where you perhaps didn't have instruments, it was just the oral age. That's all you had because technology was being developed slowly, whereas now, I mean, Apple bring out a new phone every year, they can do new stuff, so I suppose it's a lot harder to keep up with the digital age than the analog age, if that makes sense.
A whole bunch of issues there, isn't it? A lot harder to keep up. So people are trying to keep up, aren't they? But what are they trying to keep up with?
Trends.
They're trying to keep up with trends, yeah, but are they necessarily musical trends? They're trying to keep up with technology. Which is more important, the technology or the music? In analog, it used to be the music, didn't it? Okay, you collect records, but you know, it wasn't just any records. You had to collect some kind of records. But now, people talk about technology in a lot more breathless way than they talk about music, in many ways. You know, they go, oh, look at this, you know, that's new, there's iOS 82 or whatever it is, you know. And so, the idea of keeping up is also important because that's what people, it seems to me that's what people do a lot more these days, because you can. So people go on Spotify. How many people use Spotify? Alright, holdouts down here. People use those kind of digital platforms. Quite often you see them trying to keep up by checking out bands they've heard of. but not really listening to them. What they do is like they put it on, listen to the first 20 seconds, then move it on into the middle to see if it's getting any more interesting, you know. Then play another 10 seconds, and then they go, oh, yeah, I know, I've heard those guys. You know, they're not listening to music anymore, they're trying to keep up. So the pace of technology has changed the access of it. That's right. So you can listen to anything you want now. Yeah. What other things?
It's changed people's social behaviour. Like I said, when they first maybe like the more ritual, people coming together. As of now, you don't have to go anywhere.
No.
You can stay literally. You can live in your room.
You could live in your room. Have you ever read those stories? But this is the future. This is where we're going. I've read those stories about Japan. They're great. Have you been reading them? It's fantastic. It was in yesterday's newspaper and last week. It was why don't Japanese have sex anymore? Have you read this? Get the Guardian. There's loads of them. This is it's great, isn't it? That's where we're all going. That's where your kids are going. And there's a whole generation in Japan called the hikikomori, and these are guys, and they've lost their powers. A lot of them they don't leave their room anymore. They live with the parents. They don't leave the room anymore. Don't get on with the parents. If they come out, they only come out at night. They've lost the ability to interact with people. We're not talking about a few thousand people here. We're talking about millions of Japanese. You know, for those technological reasons, and that's where you get the stories. Is why have they stopped having sex? You know, this is all these newspapers. You know, the Japanese birth rate's going. I mean, they could lose a few if you ask me, but well, it's crowded over there. I used to live in Japan. I'm not being racist. It's crowded. But yeah, this is the future, and it's about what you're talking about, isn't it? Because we can survive in terms of technology. And that's what people do, don't they? I went to see somebody a while ago, and I knocked on the door. There was a shared house, and this woman said, I said, is so-and-so in? And she said, oh yeah, she's upstairs in her room. I'll just text her. I said, well, why don't you go and knock on the door? She said, oh, I'll do that. So we're losing the ability, you know.
Start a market with wardrobes with integrated fridges in.
Go and say that one again.
Get a wardrobe with an integrated fridge in it. They only live to the kitchen.
Well, you know, just look it up. Hikikomori in Japan. You know, there's millions of them doing this kind of thing. So that's the future, because of course Japan, South Korea are more technologically plugged in. We're plugged in. Other concepts. Oh, I'm going.
Business-wise, you're looking at
What?
online outlets, aren't you? Business-wise, with streaming services and things like that. That's a new thing.
Distribution,
Yeah, distribution for the digital age, which obviously you couldn't do with other things in the past. So.
Yeah. So this is digital music. It's hybridized because all that genre stuff was industrialized, generically indeterminate. If you look at the Mercury Prize this year, you know, there's people from all over the place doing loads of music stuck together. You know, it's not generic in the same kind of way it was. It's optically invisible. This is probably one of the most important things in the future, now and in the future. It's going to be stitched into pretty much everything you do in a way that people won't even see that. You know, they won't see that it's going on. I read a story of girls shopping in H&M, and they pick up something from the racks and they go in the changing room, and there's a kind of device on the wall that communicates with the clothes that they've got a label on, that sends a signal to their mobile phone that they answer saying 5 free tracks if you buy this now. You know, and this kind of thing is just going to get wired into everybody's consciousness, this optical invisibility. It's ubiquitous, which means it's everywhere. There's more music going around now than there was, you know. The music industry are making more money now than they've ever made. They're just selling less records, that's all. It's degraded, of course. We don't have hi-fi, we have MP3s. It's a degraded format. They just take stuff out so they can, so the music industry can assault us, I think is the right phrase, in a different way. Key features, of course, as we've already said, are computational. So ease of access, fast connections, more choices. This is why Spotify is popular, isn't it? Because you hit it and it plays. You don't have to wait for it to wind up. It's interconnected. There's more choice. It's multimedia. We've got Web 2 tools now for make our data processing more efficient, because that's who we are these days, isn't it? We're data processors. We spend a lot of time at the computer arranging our information on iTunes. Business concepts, streaming you mentioned. What's the biggest concepts the music industry are going with? What do they look to in the future? What's the future of the music business going to be built on? Advertising, yeah, but how do they know who to advertise to? How do they get market research? What market research are they doing? What? They're watching everything you do. All right. They know everything about you. They know what websites you go on. They know what you look at. They know everything about you. They've been doing it for years. Well, they've been doing it for years. They've been doing it for years. They've been collecting data about you. Up until about 2008, 2009, the music business was still in the business of trying to sue their customers for downloading, until they figured out that actually that's not the way to go. The way to go is to collect every bit of information you can about them, and then they can sell you what they want. They know what's in your iTunes. How many people use iTunes? Do you have Genius switched on?
No.
Well, you know about it. Genius is, of course, spyware. Spotify is spyware. It tells you what you've got in your collection, tells you what you do with it. Pretty much everything tells you what you've got in your collection and what you're doing with it. And once they have that file, and they've all got a file on you, they know who you are, what your habits are, who you're consorting with, they know everything. So that's where they're going in the future, and that's why they all pitched into Spotify. Spotify, of course, is losing money hand over fist, but it promises them, I don't know how it's going to deliver it, because I think Spotify's on the course of collapsing. But it promises them access, and a legal kind of access. So what's happened? We had digitalisation, which it upset the apple cart, didn't it, of the analogue music industry, where the computer industry started fighting against the music industry. And of course the computer industry is a lot bigger than the music industry, so it won that fight hand over fist, which is why we had copying and Napster, which of course broke it all up, made it different. Money moved downstream, which they're not happy about. Of course the record companies used to get all your money. How much did you used to give them? How much did you used to give them a month, those record companies?
Well, I think it's like 15 quid.
As much as they could get out of it, 15 quid, 18 quid sometimes, wasn't it? How much did you give them a month? You'd be giving them 50 quid a month, stuff like that, wouldn't you? And all of a sudden, we're not giving it them. Who are we giving it to? I mean, we're still paying the same for music, but we're not giving it to them. Who are we giving it to? We're giving it to the internet service providers for access in order to download it, whether you download it free or whether you pay for it. You're still paying Virgin or BT or any of those other people. So that gets you into the record shop, and that costs a lot, doesn't it? That's 25, 35, something like that, whatever it is. So we're still paying, but we're not going into... So everybody can be a transmitter here. We can talk to each other about this kind of stuff. We can share it with each other. This is called disintermediation. It used to be the music businesses that were the gatekeepers that controlled everything, but now it's not. I'll have to finish this off quick because you've got a class coming in a minute. Live performance changed the revenues here. So live performance became a lot more important because nobody's making music anymore. Nobody's making money on records anymore. So music gets reconfigured as a resource. That's what we have it these days, isn't it? You guys still pay for it. None of my students pay for it. Well, a few of them pay for it, but most of them don't pay for it. I had this class last, well, not this class, but it's in the argument. They're all going, why should I pay for it? You get it free. Why pay for it? But you can't argue with that, can you? So it gets refigured as a resource. Spotify is an example of that. Of course, record shops disappear. They're all analogue. You know, it's all analog business. That distribution disappears. You know, music magazines. Does anybody read those anymore? It's all analog, really. Get them on the web, can't you? So all that analog business is in the process of disappearing. And musicians become, they're not musicians anymore, they're just punters like everybody else. So you get this whole big business online aimed at musicians. You know, SoundCloud, Bandcamp, there's loads of them, isn't there? Hundreds of sites. They promise you pay us a few quid a month and we'll get your record out, and we'll get people to hear it, and we'll put you on different platforms. And that's a big business these days. You know, selling stuff to musicians is big business, isn't it? Because everybody is a musician now, aren't they? Just made a record, I'll put it out. I just need to sign up to a few websites, and I'll be a star, or something like that. So there's more intermediaries. There's a really good video under here about this guy telling you about the music business. And in about 4 minutes, it goes through about 300 intermediary sites that you need to sign up with or check out or stuff like that. Because that's where the business has gone these days. It's gone into intermediary sites, hasn't it? The whole idea of musical revolutions is an analog idea, isn't it? It's all that stuff. Where do musical revolutions did we have? Rock and roll in the 50s, you know, rock in the 60s, you know, punk in the 70s, dance in the 80s. All those were musical revolutions about access to production. In the 90s, everybody got access to production, didn't they? Everybody's got a recording studio now. Everybody can be heard, and that's the problem. Everybody can be heard. You can't hear anybody because everybody can be heard. But there's no more musical revolutions coming out because everybody can make a record. You know, you've got nothing coming from underneath. What we're going to be doing is rediscovering stuff of the past and joining it together in hybrid forms. So they've got control again by getting so many intermediaries. They've got spyware everywhere. Profiling is the new music business here. The income streams have changed. They've got fans to fund their own music now. You know, that used to be one of the jobs of the record companies, didn't it? Get a bit of development funding. But now they go, no, we don't want to do that. We got fund it yourself, and if you're successful, then we'll come in. You know, when you've actually done the hard work, and that's what labels do these days. Your best chance of getting funding is you, isn't it? Now we come to you for funding, or government-sponsored funding.
Well, I don't know, the culture budget's been hacked.
Yeah. But there's a lot more available through programmes these days than there ever was. The Arts Council of Wales are making funding available to bands to develop their identity, develop their portfolio, to develop their stagecraft and things like that. And that's a new idea. More product-based delivery systems, so you're going to see more things like the X Factor. The X Factor is, of course, a digital dream, isn't it? You know, you've got people queuing up around the block to sing well-known songs, so the songwriters still get some gravy out of it. They're signing away their rights. You know, the television companies are involved, the phone companies are involved. You know, this is multimedia, digital music in a big way. It's a real good product. You know, everybody's getting loads of money out of that, and kids love it, don't they? They love this stuff. So there's a great knock-on effect from things like the X Factor. People learn to sing. There's more people singing now than there were 30 or 40 years ago. All kids dream of being stars. You know, this is a fantastic product for the music industry. You know, you might not like the kind of music it produces, but, you know, we're not talking about value. You know, we're just talking about involvement here. And these things become more important: licensing rights, sync rights, advertising, product placement and branding. And this, of course, is where popular music's going. It's going into this area of making some kind of, deal, some kind of arrangement that gives more than one person a reason to play it. And branding is becoming a lot bigger. You know, there's been more books published about music branding in the last 2 or 3 years than ever before. And it's getting rearranged with business because nobody's buying the records anymore. Somebody's got to pay for this stuff. Advertising is a way forward, but it's got to do 2 or 3 different jobs. But that's where it's going to be under digital. You know, under analog, what do we have? I'm not having my music used in advertisements, wasn't it? You know, that's selling out to the man and all that kind of stuff. You know, but that's analog. You know, that doesn't exist anymore. I read this today. This is by the head of Google Music, Google Play. I read this on the news. He said, look, this is what it looks like these days. He said, you've got this free layer, but it's not free. It just means consumers aren't paying the music companies for it. Still getting paid for this kind of stuff. Free in this context doesn't have to mean copyright owners aren't making money. It just means the listeners themselves aren't playing. In that free tier, Spotify, you know, lots of that stuff. Is anybody waiting there?
Yeah, Josh, I told them to wait for you. So.
All right, I'll be there in a minute. So, you know, things like Pandora, well, that's an American thing, Last FM, YouTube, that's where kids get the music now, isn't it? You know, all my students are on YouTube, just downloading stuff all the time. So, different layers. It's the job of the music business to take you up that pyramid, you know, to induce people to get onto the next level, subscription level. You know, it's the job of the music industry is to get your interest and keep your interest. That's their business. I'll just finish this up quickly. Digital music practices, behaviour, and these are the key ideas, well, as well as business concepts, of course. What are digital music practices and behaviour? Well, we talked about consumption. You know, music's information. We've all turned into data processors, haven't we? Spend a lot of time at our computers making sure it looks good in iTunes. We get a lot of music we don't even listen to these days. You know, people have got more stuff on in their iTunes than they can ever listen to. You know, people haven't thought about it, but downloading really, free downloading is finishing. I think it's actually an analog habit, isn't it? Behaviour. It's like you spent all your life paying for this kind of stuff, and all of a sudden you can freely download it. So everybody goes, "Whoa, let's have some of that." And then everybody sat around going, you know, I've got 14 weeks of music on my iTunes. You know, if I had 3 lifetimes, I'd never be able to listen to it. What am I going to do with this stuff? And you read stories, like I read a story the other week about a guy going, well, I've got all this music I don't listen to. I decided to chuck it away. But what he did is he put it in one file on his desktop. And he said, right, from now on, I'm going to empty my iTunes, put it all there, and what I want to listen to, I'll go and get it. So you had to go and get things if you wanted to listen to. And of course that creates a relationship, and that's what we need. We need a relationship with music, and that's one of the things that digital's not done. It's kind of severed that relationship that we used to have. And that's what you guys and people in the business need to think about in terms of we have to create a relationship. You've got to create a reason. People have been buying into the myths of the online marketplace, feeding the machine. You know, it's like spending time on Facebook telling it how to market to you more successfully. You know, which is essentially what you're doing, isn't it, really? Yeah. So musicians are not astronauts anymore, they become anthropologists. We look into the back catalogue here to find out what we can put together. I heard a great band a couple of months ago. What was it called? Pavastel? Does that ring anybody's bells? Fantastic, these guys were. They were doing kind of electro swing music. So I'm in a tent at Wilmot, you know, they had 3,000 people jumping up and down, saxophones and horns, and a DJ at the back, great girl singer. You know, it's a combination of like 3 or 4 different kinds of music, but it worked really well. Everybody was going, wow, that guy's great, isn't it? So, you know, they're archaeologists plundering the past, coming up with new forms. We're used to this kind of stuff now. So things like authenticity, not authenticity of where the music comes from, but authenticity of our experience of it in its new form. So different kind of ideas about that. More music everywhere. There's just going to be more music. And of course the music's going to be fan-funded and unpaid. So largely musicians are going to be expected to work for nothing for a long time. Musicians have got to work for nothing in analog terms, but create their own idea of what value is in digital terms. Teaching and learning, moving online, decline in learning certain instruments. What I've put down is tech porn there, which is what I alluded to earlier on. People more interested in the tech than the music in many ways. Oh, I've got this great app. You know, I've got a mate who does it, guitarist, keeps going, oh, look, I've just bought this. It's fantastic, you know. You know, he talks really excited. I can see you guys laughing. You'll recognise it. Okay, I'm finishing up now, I'm honest. I'm going. Algorithms, they're the future. And of course, streaming and profiling. Algorithms are the programs that tell them everything there is to know about your behaviour, what you want, what you're going to want, and all that kind of stuff. And of course, the end of privacy that comes along with it. That's gone out the window. That's an analog idea. And the other downside of it, you know, the ensnaring of human energy that is sitting on your computer listening to music, you know, wasting your time, you know, flashing through websites, spending half your life doing things that you're not really interested in, you know, that has to be talked about. So that's about it. I wish I had half an hour to talk to you about this, but I've got people coming in that I've got appointments with. I'll just leave you with a screen which you might read about the internet being the new media environment here. This guy, Dubber, it is again, suggests that we need to know about our new media environment. It is not a way to market music, it's a way to take part in a conversation. He suggests there are only two types of value online, that conversation and the things that conversation is taking place about.